philosophical mysticism, proto-archetypes. So we're going to be talking about proto-archetypes. We've talked about um, regular archetypes in previous lessons, but now we're going to be talking about these other types of archetypes that I call proto-archetypes. But before getting to proto-archetypes, we should first start off with aesthetic culture. So, um, and the proto-archetypes are going to be products of aesthetic culture. Um, so, what is art? Well, culture could be many things. Sort of getting to this point. Um, but I primarily am going to concern myself with art or aesthetic culture. I take it art or aesthetic culture best captures the zeitgeist of a society, its essence, the spirit of a culture as it thrives. Um, there's also other aspects of the zeitgeist as well and other types of culture. For instance, I'll talk about scientific culture in another lesson. But let's focus here on aesthetic culture. So what is aesthetic culture? Well, first off, aesthetic culture has to do with art. And art at its most primitive is a combination of memory or immediate sense experience and feeling. That's what I'm taking art to be. At its most basic is a combination of memory or sense experience and feeling. This together forming an aesthetic experience. However, there seems to be something more in play, at least for very sophisticated types of art. So that's the basics, but when we talk about the zeitgeist, when we talk about aesthetic culture, there seems to be a little bit more going on than just this. One answer is that art involves capturing the universal in the concrete. And for instance, like Ayn Rand held this view. That's one answer. But I don't think that's quite right. It's in the ballpark, but I don't think that's quite right for true art as such. Because this would entail that art should concern itself with ideas. The universal is an idea. So that art should concern itself with ideas. But I take it ideas are not the stuff of art. That's my view. Though, that being said, there does seem to be some type of dance, a sort of dance that occurs between the universal and the concrete happening when it comes to art. In fact, art actually seems to be, both universal and concrete at the same time. So what's going on here? Fortunately, in my flavor of philosophy, the type of philosophy I'm arguing for, there is something that we can point to that delicately lies in the space between universality and concreteness. And this is archetypes. So archetypes are going to be this sort of weird thing that are both, or at least they kind of toe the line between being universal and concrete at the same time. So when we talk about art, this is something that we could sort of look at. So let's talk about art and archetypes. So I'm saying this is the direction we should go. But in terms of the archetypes, even though art, we could talk about art in many different ways, it need not be drawn from or concern archetypes. You could talk about art outside of archetypes, but I take it the archetypes are especially suited to be the stuff of art and aesthetic culture. So you could talk about art in the sort of absence of archetypes, but archetypes are especially suited to be the stuff of art and aesthetic culture. And if you sort of go and learn more about archetypes, you hear this in sort of regular sort of conversations these days too about archetypes and art. So archetypes are really, really suited to be the stuff of art. And here's why. There's a few reasons why. Firstly, archetypes are strongly emotion laden. I've sort of talked about this when I talked about archetypes in previous lessons. Archetypes are strongly emotion laden. And because art in the usual sense will need to arouse emotions to function as such, archetypes are particularly suited to the task. So if you're talking about art, you have to, if you're talking about art, at least in my view, it has to involve feeling. It has to involve emotion. If it doesn't involve feeling or emotion, it's not really art. It's something else. And because the archetypes are strongly emotion laden, they really go quite well with talking about art. Archetypes also tend to be merged with its associative emotions. So the archetypes tend to sort of come with certain through evolutionary means, going way back. They tend to sort of be merged with their associative emotions. And because of this, when we sort of encounter an archetype, especially in the form of art, it can create awe and sublimity in its effects. Because people unsuccessfully try to somehow separate the feeling from the universal pattern. And this sort of creates this sort of sense of awe and sublimity. It's this really weird thing. And what's going on here is that you just can't do it. These archetypes emerged millions of years ago. You're not going to be able to separate the effect. You're not going to be able to separate the feeling from the universal pattern. And when people encounter art in this form, they're really confused, and that sort of creates a sort of sense of awe and sublimity. If anything can do that. Second, archetypes are present in all humans. All humans have archetypes in their head. They're present in all humans. So if we are going to create a zeitgeist or aesthetic culture that is shared by all, this is an effective means to do so. So if you're trying to sort of create this sort of universal aesthetic, archetypes are a way to do so. Third, archetypes are unique in that they allow for similar or even identical sentiments in a large number of people. Not everything can do this, but archetypes are able to do this. They're able to create very similar sentiments in very, very many people because it's sort of, these archetypes are ancient. This can unite a culture and create a reliable reference point in drawing a shared aesthetic or meaningful cultural experience. So if you're going to do this, the best way to do this is through archetypes. You could do it through other means, but if you're really trying to sort of unite and create a sort of shared, meaningful aesthetic cultural experience, this is a really good way to do so. Even if people don't understand why it's happening, it works. And finally, fourth, archetypes have familiar historical properties. So for instance, everyone has reverence towards the mother archetype or fascination toward the maiden archetype, for instance, on account of it being part of our history as far back as anyone can remember or might be recorded. There's a warm feeling toward it because it's always been there with us. And we sort of have this sort of warm feeling toward it. We sort of have this sort of, it gets a response out of us. And also too, it makes it, usually the archetypes are going to make an early appearance in your childhood through like stories and fables and myths. So you encounter Cinderella. You read about Cinderella as a kid. That's the maiden archetype. That's what you're sort of getting hit with. And somehow it just makes sense as you grow older. And it sort of has these historical properties. And it sort of hits us in a good way. The absolutes. So that's sort of the universal aesthetic that I'm talking about when the sort of archetypes that we've been talking about so far in previous lessons. But there do seem to be unique types of culture or aesthetic culture that must be actively maintained and defended against deterioration and infiltration. So there are these unique types of culture. The mother archetype isn't going away anytime soon. The maiden archetype isn't going away anytime soon. But there are these sort of unique types of culture that might not be as sort of deeply ingrained in us. So I'll take this sort of unique cultural brand And most cultures have a unique cultural brand, at least used to, before like globalization and stuff. So I think the unique cultural brand, as opposed to the general universal aesthetic, to be what's captured by the zeitgeist or the spirit of the times. And in this sense, the zeitgeist takes on a greater meaning and elevates individuals more so than could be explained by the collection of historical archetypes alone. So we're talking about like unique cultures, the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. There's something else going on besides just the basic, very universal general archetypes that we've had for millions of years. There's something else going on. So what's going on? There's been attempts to kind of get at this, I think unsuccessfully for many people, many philosophers. And one attempt is this. Defenders of something like a dynamic absolute take cultural change to result from a rational process. So we're talking about the absolute. We're talking about, in most cases, for the German idealist, we're talking about this sort of rational process. But I take it, while it does follow an evolutionary process, there's nothing rational about it at all. The archetypes, the absolutes, they're not rational. I'm going to sort of stand my ground here. They're not rational, but there is a sort of evolutionary process that brings these things about. So there's some sort of order in that sense, but it's not a rational order. It's evolutionary order. And if I might temporarily run with the term, the absolutes, in my view, are in fact archetypes, not glorified ideas or any of the other odd things that the later German idealists are going to call it. So for me, my view here is that the absolutes, as they've been used, in the historical sense with the German idealist, I think it's actually archetypes that are the absolutes. Or they say the absolute, but I'm using this in the plural sense. The absolute is many archetypes. They're not ideas. They're not any of the other weird, crazy things that the German idealists have talked about, hundreds of years ago. But what's important here is sort of develop this argument that I'm getting at with the proto-archetypes. The absolutes that I'm talking about are not the same universally established archetypes we've been talking about thus far. So the absolutes aren't the mother and the maiden and the hero and the villain. These aren't the absolutes. The absolutes are not the same as the universally established archetypes. There's something else. There's something new. They're new. I take it the absolutes are more like proto-archetypes. So the term I'm using here is proto-archetypes that have yet to be permanently ingrained in the human brain. So the universal archetypes, they're in the brain. They're for the most part, they're permanent. They're not going anywhere. Whereas the proto-archetypes are going to be very similar to archetypes, but they're not permanent yet. They're temporary. They're not yet ingrained in the human brain. Not yet. So they function a lot like the regular archetypes, but they're not really permanent in the same way. Proto-archetypes. So sort of building on this, given a very long period of time, if a culture remains static, and the same cultural patterns continue to repeat, proto-archetypes would eventually become permanent archetypes. So if it happened, just like with the archaic archetypes that developed over hundreds of thousands of years, maybe millions of years, they sort of get this repeating pattern that just kept going over and over again. If this happened for whatever reason, it would be the case through evolutionary means that the proto-archetypes would eventually become permanent archetypes. They'd become permanently embedded in the human brain. But ever since we started talking and improving our societies, proto-archetypes have been in flux and moving fast. And most of the proto-archetypes are only hundreds of years old. Maybe some are like thousands of years old, but they're not very old. They're new. They're very new. And they keep changing, and it makes it really hard for them to get ingrained into the brain through evolutionary means. And going back to some of the first lessons that we talked about, what happens here by being ingrained in the brain, the archetypes become innate memories. They become innate. They don't have to, you do have to learn them in a sense, but there's a pattern, there's a mold there that's innate. And the archetypes, the archaic archetypes have this. The proto-archetypes don't, but they could. Given a very long time, the proto-archetypes could eventually become an innate memory themselves, innate mold themselves, and become ingrained in the brain. But for the last few thousand years, or last 10,000 years, I guess, things have been moving really, really fast. They keep changing and changing and changing. It's really not enough time, at least not yet. So the proto-archetypes, as opposed to the regular archetypes, are in flux. And they've been changing rapidly. Though they do occasionally pause long enough for us to notice. Sometimes they do. And this might be what a particular age is, if we're able to see it as we live through it. So sometimes there's like a pause. Like in the Middle Ages, there was a few pauses that lasted like several hundred years. You kind of see the age as it unfolds. But again, while in flux, it is in fact the aspiration of proto-archetypes to achieve permanent status and become ingrained in the brain through evolutionary means. So it's not magic. It's not like this sort of weird thing. It's just innate memories. And if you just sort of repeat the pattern over and over from generation to generation, from generation to generation to generation, over and over and over again, the same exact patterns, the same cultural patterns, evolution will embed it in the human brain. And maybe some of the proto-archetypes have sort of made progress towards doing this. But they probably need like a little bit more time in most cases. But the proto-archetypes, even though they're sort of not permanent just yet, they do sort of affect us. They do have a very similar effect as the regular archetypes. And in support of this goal, people tend to vehemently defend their unique culture and try to maintain it. So in the unique cultures, like I'm talking about here, our unique culture, since after we moved away from being like hunter-gatherers, our unique culture is mainly just proto-archetype. That's what we're dealing with. That's what a unique culture is. A unique sort of cultural brand has to do with the proto-archetypes. And people, for whatever reason, well, I guess this is the reason that they do, the reason that people sort of vehemently, they sort of defend their unique culture, they love it so much and they want to maintain it, it's because of the proto-archetypes. It's sort of continuing with this. The reason people tend to vehemently defend their unique culture and try to maintain it is because archetypes do in fact have causal powers. And there's an impetus for archetypes to influence behavior in a way to ensure their own preservation. If this wasn't the case, archetypes would have never come into existence in the first place. And you might think about it. We don't really think about it this way, but why? You might ask, why do you care so much about your unique culture? Why even care? Why does it matter to you what your culture is, right? Your particular unique cultural brand. Well, the reason that you care so much, at least in my view, is that you're being manipulated into caring by the archetypes. The archetypes are trying to continue their own survival. And they do so by influencing your behavior in a way that you seek to preserve that same archetype. So you're sort of being manipulated here by the archetypes to preserve them. So the best way to preserve the archetypes is to continue to sort of do the same thing you've been doing for the last 100 years, 1,000 years. You keep repeating the same cultural patterns over and over and over again. That's how you maintain the archetypes. And the reason we do this is because we're sort of blindly following what the archetypes tell us to do. Otherwise, if you really think hard about it, there's no reason to defend your culture, your unique culture. Why do you care? It's going to be different 100 years from now, or 200 years from now, or 300 years from now. Why do you care so much about your unique cultural brand? Well, the reason you do is because the archetypes are forcing you or causally influencing you to think this way or behave this way. And it's really no different for the proto-archetypes. The proto-archetypes function the same exact way as the regular archetype in terms of like manipulating humans to sort of continue this these same sort of cultural patterns over and over and over again, reliving the lives of your ancestors, your father and your father's father and your grandfather. Proto-archetypes are no different from the regular archetypes. They manipulate us in the same way. And of course, that's their best bet. Because they're going to survive, they have to sort of repeat the same cultural patterns for a pretty long time. I mean, it's really unclear how long this will take. I mean, does it take 10 generations, 100 generations, 1,000 generations? It's unclear how long it will actually take for the proto-archetypes, but given enough time, it will eventually become permanent. And it will maintain itself if you just sort of keep forcing us to relive the same cultural patterns. So the proto-archetypes, in terms of their causal efficacy, they function very similar to the regular archaic archetypes. But there are some differences. And one difference is that for the proto-archetypes, competition is much more fierce. Because there's way more proto-archetypes than there are regular archetypes. So there's many more of them. So in that way, they're different. And there's more competition. And the proto-archetypes have more to lose. In most cases, extinction. So, I mean, a regular archetype, the archaic archetype, if you sort of like, a few generations don't think about the mother archetype, it's no big deal. It'll come back. It's already ingrained in the human brain. It's semi-permanent. I mean, eventually it could go away, I guess, over a very long time. But for the most part, the mother archetype, the maiden archetype, it's already ingrained in the brain. So if you went a few generations without that cultural pattern, no big deal. It'll come back. I mean, it's almost guaranteed to come back. Whereas for the proto-archetypes, that's not the case. If you go a generation or two without enforcing the proto-archetypes, they go extinct. They disappear forever. Once a proto-archetype disappears, they're gone. They're gone for good. They go extinct. So they are different in that regard. So there's many more of them, and they risk extinction if they don't force humans to continue the cultural pattern. Whether in your own culture or forcing your culture on other people. That's a good way to sort of ensure your pattern survive, is to sort of spread it throughout the world. But if you don't sort of continue these patterns, they could disappear within a generation or two or three. Because the proto-archetypes are not permanent in the same way the regular archetypes are. And sort of building on this as well, the proto-archetypes are also not maintained naturally. So the regular archetypes, the archaic archetypes are natural. They're it's just sort of part of human nature, kind of. The proto-archetypes are not maintained naturally. They're not going to naturally just sort of maintain themselves. They need to be preserved with force. Forcefully preserved. whether through tradition or education or laws or these cultural preservation programs, whatever. You got, in order to keep the proto-archetypes going, you got to use force. They have to be intentionally maintained. And again, in most cases, you have to do this through force. It's not going to just naturally just sort of linger on forever. You have to force the cultural patterns, the proto-archetypes, to keep repeating themselves. Otherwise, they go away. They go extinct. So if you have like fathers and mothers that never pass on their traditions to the children, those traditions are going to disappear. Those unique cultural brands, those unique proto-archetypes are going to disappear if the parents or the city or the state doesn't, or the entire culture doesn't forcefully sort of keep passing it on over and over and over again. These things will go extinct. Proto-archetypes in the zeitgeist. So sort of like I said, in many cases, culture is maintained through momentum. It tends to be that way. People, again, this is, in my view, it's likely we're just being manipulated by the archetypes. The archetypes are manipulating us to think this way, behave this way. But culture tends to be maintained through momentum. People prefer to hang on to the past and what was passed down to them, what their parents passed down to them and grandfathers and so on. So momentum is probably the easiest way that cultures are maintained. But aesthetic culture, if we're going to distinguish this from cultural simplicity, is a little different. In a sea of proto-archetypes to draw from, there's a choice that might be made. So there's a choice. So you have so many proto-archetypes floating around. There's a choice. You can make a choice. So a choice might be made to select cultural features, or select the cultural features that are the most beautiful or inspiring or useful or even like weird and bizarre that might appeal to you. There's a sort of choice to select from different proto-archetypes in terms of what you're going to preserve or sort of what you're going to let into the culture. And there are cultural movements that seek to escape the past rather than preserve it, to try something new. And aesthetic culture is really like sort of special in this way. So the things that sort of like usually even before other cultural events happen, the aesthetic culture will sort of make the first move. The artist will sort of start speculating into what's next. So the aesthetic culture tends to like move first. And this is really important. This is an interesting sort of fact about the proto-archetypes. And the proto-archetypes are going to allow for this, to sort of allow for new ages to sort of come into existence. And aesthetic culture is unique in this regard. And this is a grand feat because it gives us a chance to see, feel, know something novel, and distinguish ourselves from the past and make new history. Whereas the hunter-gatherers for most of our history really didn't have much to choose from. They didn't have like this sort of, they couldn't really change the past so much. They couldn't really try new things. They couldn't try out new cultural patterns. They were kind of just stuck to this really basic mold. Whereas, since the proto-archetypes come on the scene, probably a little bit during hunter-gatherer times, but mostly after we started building cities and stuff, settling down, it sort of gives us these options. So we could sort of, we could try, we could feel something novel, and we could distinguish ourselves from the past and make new history. And novelty is something that tends to get remembered and studied. And in this way, aesthetic ages come into existence because of the proto-archetypes. So this is one view. It's my view on what aesthetic culture is, what proto-archetypes are as compared to like the regular archetypes we talked about in previous lessons. I think there are proto-archetypes. I think they are there, and aesthetic culture really is going to take these proto-archetypes to be very important. If you want to learn more, check out my book, Philosophical Mysticism, a Spiritual Handbook for Mankind by Nicholas Schroeder. Definitely worth a read.